Welcome. We are going to get started with the lasting impact session. I'm going to share my screen here to get us started. All right. So this is a session where we're going to be talking about the paper that received the Lasting Impact Award for this year. A little bit of background there. There was a Lasting Impact Award Committee. I chaired that with Jonathan Gruden, Carrie Karahalios, Hideaki Kazuko, and Steve Whitaker. So thank you to them. The criteria for a lasting impact paper at CSCW is that it needs to have been published at the CSCW conference, needs to have been published at least a decade ago, and the idea is that it's had a profound impact on CSCW research and or how we think about the field of CSCW. So those are the criteria that we had in mind as we were thinking about the nominees. The process was first we invited nominations. We had a Facebook survey. There were past nominations. There were individuals who suggested papers to us and so forth. We looked at the citations and recent downloads in the digital library, although that was more instructive. It was not criteria. The committee members independently read and commented on all nominees, all papers, looked at the citations and recent downloads and so forth. And we whittled it down to the 5 most competitive papers. And then we reread all of those papers, commented again, and then met as a committee and unanimously decided on the winning paper. This was a very clear winner, which made our jobs easier. So the winner this year is Patterns of Contact and Communication in Scientific Research Collaboration. This was authored by Bob Kraut, Carmen Aguido, and Jolene Gallagher. And we'll have some of those authors with us today to talk about and reflect on their experience. So in terms of why this paper, the committee was impressed by this influential and elegant work. Focuses on distance in scientific collaboration. Committee felt like it was really an innovative paper, very rich. There were 3 different studies of different types that were reported in the paper. And the message that came out of this was very convincing, very powerful, yet very simple. We also were excited that the findings suggested guidelines for collaboration spaces that are still relevant today. And felt that it was surprising to realize that many of these claims, including the challenges and importance of informal communication, the importance of building rapport, the importance of creating a sense of identity, and so forth, are still themes that we talk about in the CSCW literature today. So I'm going to leave it at that and introduce our program today. So we're going to hear first from 3 of the authors, one by video. So we'll hear from Bob Kraut and Jolene Gallagher. And they'll talk a little bit about their experience and reflections in writing the paper, summarize what they think is important about it, and so forth. And then we'll have reflections on impact, relevance, and evolving technology from 4 panelists: Judy Olson, Thomas Neumeyer, John Tang, and Krista Lopez. And then we will have a little bit of a panelist discussion and then open it up for Q&A. One of the things that we request is please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. And what we'll be doing is monitoring those questions and moderating that discussion when we get there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Bob and Jolene.
Okay. So I'm Bob Kraut, and Jolene Gallagher will be speaking in a little bit. We'd like to thank the awards committee for recognizing our paper from over 30 years ago for the CSCW Lasting Impact Award. In addition to the honor that this award gives us, it gave us the opportunity to review this old work and to renew friendships that had weakened with time and distance. The goals of the short presentation that we're going to be doing are to review the original paper, since many of you in the audience weren't born when it was written, place it in an intellectual and personal context, and discuss a little bit its current relevance. Although the Lasting Impact Award was given to a single paper from 1988, we're going to take the liberty of assuming that we're being recognized for the program of related research that we conducted in the 1980s and early 90s, and that focused on collaboration, the role of physical proximity in facilitating collaboration, and the technologies that could potentially support collaboration at a distance. We started our research with the observation that successful collaboration seems to depend to a large degree on co-location and physical proximity. This observation is reflected in the two charts on the screen that show that the likelihood that members of a large R&D organization successfully collaborated by co-authoring a paper together. We selected 93 researchers who had published at least 2 internal research reports, with at least one having a co-author. We looked at all 4,278 pairings of these researchers and predicted the likelihood that that pair would produce a co-authored report together based on their physical proximity, the similarity of their research interests, and their organizational proximity. The researchers were located in separate buildings and separate campuses about 40 miles apart, each in multi-story buildings. For physical proximity, we used the corporate phone book to determine where a pair was located, whether they were on the same corridor, different corridors in the same floor, different floors in the same building, or in different buildings entirely. This research similarity by using a measure of the semantic similarity of the abstracts of their solo authored papers. We measured organizational similarity as they worked with each other on the 3-level organizational chart. Were they in the same small research group of about 7 people, the larger department of about 30 people, or in the same laboratory of about 120 people? As you can see from the chart on the left, researchers were much more likely to collaborate if they had research interests in common, than if they didn't. And the chart on the right shows that they were much more likely to collaborate if they were in the same department versus in different departments. But these effects of research similarity and organizational closeness depended on physical proximity. For example, the graph on the left shows that about 14% of pairs with strong research similarity co-authored papers if they were on the same corridor, but this dropped to about 1% if they were on different floors in the same building. Similarly, 13% of people in the same department collaborated if they were in the same corridor, but only 2% did if they were in different floors of the same building. Much of the rest of the paper and our research program then tried to understand the mechanisms through which physical proximity enabled successful collaboration, and to build technologies that tried to replicate the benefits of physical proximity when people were not co-located. Communication frequency seems to mediate the effect of proximity on collaboration. Physical proximity dramatically increases the frequency of communication among potential collaborators. Thomas Allen demonstrated this in his seminal book, Managing the Flow of Technology, in 1977, by showing the exponential decline in weekly communication among potential collaborators as a function of distance. And we showed a similar phenomena among collaborators in our 1988 paper, even though the widespread use of email by this time and in this company should have made distance irrelevant. One of the reasons that physical proximity increases communication frequency is because it allows unplanned, spontaneous communication. One way, I mean, it's hard to study spontaneous communication because you're never there when it occurs. But one way we studied spontaneous communication was to randomly sample locations and times in a large research facility. If we saw 2 or more people talking, we interrupted them and asked them how that conversation came to be. Only 12% of these meetings were scheduled in advance, and over 50% were completely spontaneous, where the presence of the other person simultaneously opened a channel for communication and reminded people that they had something to talk about. Another way we studied spontaneous communication was by simply placing a video camera in a corridor and letting them run. To give you a sense of how proximity encourages spontaneous communication, here's a brief video clip of somebody walking down a corridor. While passing one office, he notices, let me see if I can get this to run. Nope. Maybe I won't show you it. So here's that brief video of somebody walking down the corridor. While passing one office, he notices that a colleague has his door open and seems to be free. He says hello and continues down the corridor. 7 seconds later, I'll play it again because it's short. 7 seconds later, however, even though he's already passed the open doorway, 2 phenomena cause him to reverse his steps and stop to have a brief conversation. First, the mere sight of his colleague jogged his memory that they had something to talk about. And second, the hello served as a channel checking mechanism, indicating that the colleague's attention was free and available for collaboration. And one interesting kind of side note here is that a co-worker was walking down the corridor and sees them in their collaboration and thereby picks up some awareness information about who is talking with whom. So collaborations can emerge from these types of spontaneous communication. And Jolene will kind of go into this in more detail.
Are you hearing me and seeing me?
Yep, you're up.
Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be talking with you today. Like Bob, I'm pleased to be honored for this ancient work. If we hadn't written it down, it would have been a challenge to remember it well enough to tell you about it, but fortunately we did write it down. Building on the observations of researchers at Belcourt that Bob just illustrated in the video, the observations of Allen published in the 70s, and the quantitative study of organizational and physical proximity that Bob just described, we set out to understand more about how collaboration happens, how it is initiated, and how it unfolds over time and across tasks. To do this, we conducted 70-hour-long semi-structured interviews with authors of co-authored papers in 3 disciplines: social psychology, organizational studies, and computer science, all fields that we thought we had some hope of understanding what the authors were telling us about what they were doing. The interviewees provided a narrative history of their collaborations. They discussed the decision to work together, the evolution of the project, the division of labor and coordination of work, how they figured out how to apportion recognition and award for the project, and how they identified problems that arose during the collaboration, told us how they addressed them. At every stage, we asked about the frequency and character of communication. Based on those interviews, we developed a model that informed the rest of our work, which is shown in the slide here. we differentiated phases of collaboration from initiation to actually executing work, and finally getting the results ready for external presentation outside the research group or in journal publications. At each phase, we differentiated the type of work being done. There is relationship work in which collaborators actually do the research work. I'm sorry, there's relationship work in which collaborators work on building and maintaining a working relationship. And there is task or production work in which people do the actual work itself. Today, we'll focus on the initiation stage when people start their collaboration. At that time, potential collaborators learn about each other, establish a personal relationship, commit themselves to working together, and iteratively plan a project in increasing detail. Although some researchers had an existing project in mind for which they were seeking a partner with particular expertise, it was much more frequent in our data in these interviews that establishing friendly and collegial relationships and establishing compatibility in research interests came first. One reason for the powerful effect of proximity is that it enabled people to solve the primary relationship and task level concerns of assessing and establishing compatibility easily and at low cost. People could get together over lunch or a cup of coffee and exchange ideas casually. If both individuals found the conversations and each other stimulating and enjoyable, they might discuss the possibilities for joint research more directly and seriously. A second point to emphasize here is the recurrent nature of some research tasks. There is, for instance, almost always some element of planning occurring. It might be big planning, answering the question of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, a phenomenon that occurs again when planning presentations and papers. And there's more fine-grained detail planning about who will do which tasks and on what schedules, what will be done by Tuesday and who will get it done, for instance. Excuse me. Proximity doesn't simply boost the frequency of communication, but also improves the quality of communication in multiple ways by enabling informal communication. When we began this work, we didn't have a rigorous definition of informal communication, but we fleshed out the notion based on our own observation along with work by Clark and Brennan on conversational grounding and a paper by Olson and Olson called Distance Matters that was published in 2000. Of these elements of informal communication shown here on the right, we hypothesized that the spontaneity of timing, the availability of potential participants, and flexibility as the topic, that is, talking about mutual interests without having a preset agenda, were most important during the initiation phase. However, when collaborators were actually doing the work, communication requirements shifted. Having a common context and rich media became more important. To establish common ground and improve the efficiency of communication, people needed to see what others were talking about by pointing to sketches on a whiteboard, code during software code reviews, physical devices that they were engineering, or documents that they were working on together. Remember that this research was conducted before shared text editors or sophisticated shared virtual reality applications became available. Therefore, being in the same place at the same time made sharing these views much easier. Highly interactive communication, where people can respond quickly to what another has said and even provide back-channel communication through eye contact and head nods and such, to signal understanding and agreement, are always important. For example, the interactive communication is important during the initiation phase as collaborators are converting vague research ideas into specific concrete plans. And it's important in the execution and writing phases so that collaborators can quickly give each other feedback on a moment-by-moment basis to indicate what they have understood and talk about what needs to be changed. All right, next slide, Bob. In many cases, people who ultimately produce a collaborative research product start out without an intent to collaborate. For example, Bob and I first met through mutual friends at a social psychology conference. The next year, we both attended the same conference, but our mutual friends weren't there. As both of us are rather shy, and neither of us knew many people at the conference, we ended up hanging out together. Bob had picked out a comedy show that he wanted to see, and as a lover of stand-up, I was delighted to go with him. We also had dinner together at a somewhat unfortunate Mexican restaurant, and it was during that dinner that we began to talk about scientific collaboration as a social phenomenon worthy of study. We'd had no prior experience in working with each other, but through those interactions, we found that we enjoyed each other and had interests in common. We did carry out much of the work that we did together at different locations, I should say when we were employed at different locations, but we met as frequently as we could to review data, to figure out what we wanted to say in papers and presentations, and to plan new work. Our interviews taught us that our experience was unusual. In most cases, people are co-located when they begin new research relationships, new collaborative relationships. Through frequent informal communication, they identify common interests, intellectual compatibilities, and complementarities, and develop interpersonal liking and trust. People collaborate because they can get access to resources that aren't available when they work alone. Those resources can be tangible, like money, research assistance, lab space, and intellectual ones like collaborators with complementary skills, with expertise in particular areas. In addition, collaboration changes the dynamics of research, the process of research in desirable ways, providing a sounding board for ideas, getting help, working out difficult problems, and especially making the process for doing research more fun. For most people in our sample, collaboration emerged from frequent informal communication. We also found that when people moved apart, their work slowed and they especially found it difficult to start new projects together. Now I'm going to hand this back to Bob, who will talk about our efforts to build and test technologies that would provide some of the advantages of informal communication occurring within proximity to remote collaborators. Bob?
Okay. We use these observations that Jolene described of how proximity supports informal communication and collaboration as the inspiration for some technology prototypes. The first was an attempt to simulate walking down a corridor populated by people you already know. And let me play a short clip illustrating Cruiser, the technology that we built and evaluated that attempted to implement this virtual hallway idea. The second technology we built and evaluated was our video window system, which was a ripoff of Xerox PARC's open video link between a couple of their locations. We used always-on video to connect two coffee lounges. In the first clip here, we see that the video we see the video window supported coordination between two researchers already working together. The person in the bottom part of the image notices that his collaborator, Lonnie, who's on the top, were supposed to meet to go over a presentation. Lonnie apologizes and they arrange to start their meeting. So you can tell this clip is pretty old because Lanny is talking about bringing view graphs. For those of you who don't know, pieces of plastic where you put your words on. The second clip is interesting, not because it shows collaboration, but because it shows how these casual, unplanned conversations can be used to develop and enforce organizational norms. That is, it creates a sense of place that's distinct from others. Two research administrators are jokingly chiding each other for coming back late from lunch. The clip ends with them accusing each other of, quote, enjoying bankers' hours.
Bob, we're not getting the sound on this, or at least I'm not.
Me either.
Well, probably isn't worthwhile showing them, but what's happening is that one of them notices the other coming back late from lunch. She accuses her of coming in late. The second one defends herself saying, but it's not really my lunch, I'm helping somebody else. And the first one says, and you talk about my banker's hours. Over time, we came to realize that physical proximity doesn't just support the frequent informal communication. Physical proximity also allows people to share work artifacts and work on them simultaneously. And this sharing substantially increases common ground among collaborators and makes communication much more efficient. At about this time, Judy and Gary Olson were prototyping and evaluating a shared text editor called Shreddit, well before Google Docs and Microsoft's shared version of Word. And we played around with technology that allowed people in different locations to share views of physical objects that they were working on. This head-mounted camera and head-mounted display allowed people doing physical tasks to see what each was working on. However, in retrospect, we believe we were too focused on using video to simulate collaboration. And I'll let Carmen Ajito, who's not here today, but who recorded some comments to talk about this. And let's see if this audio plays. If not, we'll have 6 minutes of dead time. So just tell me if it's working.
I'm not hearing anything.
You're not hearing anything?
No.
No, I'm not either. Bob, I wonder if you can play it outside of the Google Doc.
Or reshare in Zoom and check the audio box, I think is what might be missing.
Ah,
What is it?
so stop sharing and then reshare, but click the audio box.
Share computer audio, I think is what it's labeled.
Sorry, too many things are popping up on my screen.
So when you go to click share screen on the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little box that says share sound. If you click that, we should be able to hear you.
where I currently. Hello all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in real time today, but as you hear this, I'm on a high-speed train traveling from Paris to Barcelona, where I currently live. I do want to thank the CSCW Award Committee and express how honored I feel that our paper was chosen for this year's Lasting Impact Award, even if it does feel like cruel and unusual punishment to get us to give a talk about a topic that I at least haven't thought about for over 30 years. In talking among ourselves about what would be a useful start to this session and stimulate conversation, Bob, Jolene, and I felt that we should pull together some thoughts about the context of the work we were doing back then, and looking back from where we are now, think about what we might have missed at that point and what might be applied going forward. So what was happening in technology development 35 years ago? Access to bandwidth was exploding with the deployment of fiber across the country, and simultaneously, Moore's Law was really beginning to take off. Technology companies, including the one that Bob, Jolene, and I were working for, were eager to fill all that capacity and monetize it. So the focus was on CPU intensive and high bandwidth applications with maximum use of high definition video. There was heavy focus on synchronous technology replacement for being there and on formal multi-point communications to support teams and collaborative work. SMS texting hadn't appeared on the scene, with the first text sent in 1992, years after our paper was published, and the first phone with a keyboard introduced in 1997, enabling texting to go mainstream in the early years of the new millennium. And yet, even though there was much less focus on low bandwidth data apps, if we look back from where we are today, it's interesting to observe that by far the most widely used applications in workplace and collaborative settings are much lighter weight apps that support asynchronous, informal, unscheduled communications, such as SMS texting, Slack, and WhatsApp, as well as email. Of course, the last few years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the changes and restrictions it imposed on all of us have brought about enormous changes in the workplace. The shutting down of physical workplaces gave rise to a massive increase in the use of technology to enable not only remote work, but collaboration as well. Many digital tools were introduced at lightning speed and without orderly rollout or training, and with little or no process or work system analysis or design. This has constituted the largest natural CSCW experiment in the history of the field and is rich in learnings which undoubtedly have been the focus of this entire 2022 conference. Certainly an exciting time that almost makes me want to return to the field. But what stands out for me is that after all these years of technology push, it took a forcing function as major as a global pandemic to bring video communication into the mainstream. In preparing for this session, I perused the recent literature on changes brought about by the pandemic and also conducted a few informal interviews with friends and family working in various fields and occupations to hear some specific details of how their workplaces adapted and changed. And I'd like to offer my personal impressions and observations. Possibly through the lens of my own confirmation bias, I looked at work from Microsoft, finding that in spite of video and other technologies, the pandemic seemed to lead to less collaboration and more single worker focus time, as well as a shift from scheduled meetings to more spontaneous messaging. This was confirmed by a couple of the people I interviewed who work in very different settings and fields. When asked what technologies are currently most useful to support teamwork, no one mentioned video, and the top mentions were screen sharing and document editing with Microsoft Teams and SharePoint, chatting and messaging with Slack, WhatsApp, and of course email, joint calendaring, and meeting scheduling. Features in some applications that provide a subtle signal of online presence seem to be highly valued by all. I heard numerous complaints about technology not working well, from buggy cloud editing with SharePoint to systems crashing when fancy formatting is attempted. There was a sense that IT equipment for working out of the office still falls short of what might be optimal for permanent remote work, and people are glad to be getting back to their office, even if still on a part-time basis. It was interesting for me to observe that the cultural norms, work styles, and relationships in work groups often drive the technologies that are used and seen as useful. For example, one public health researcher told me that her organization sees spontaneous messaging directed to people's phones as intrusive and inappropriate, but not when they're directed to teammates' computers. On the other hand, a content developers organization uses WhatsApp for constant group and one-on-one messaging. In one organization, having your camera on or not during a meeting is hierarchically determined. Clients typically don't switch on the video, but the staff of the contracted organization views it as mandatory to show themselves on camera to their clients. In one organization, the use of Zoom with client managers working from their homes with pets and babies crawling around in the background humanized the relationships and gave rise to stronger team feeling, which has persisted to date. In sum, as the push to develop ever more immersive and rich technologies continues, I can't help but wonder if the lessons learned from the last 30 years of technology use by teams and collaborators, as well as what is emerging from the last few years of enforced change, are being applied for the benefit of end users. I'm quite certain that this audience is working very hard to make this happen. Thank you.
So Carmen's on vacation, but her points are well supported. So in organizing this conference session, for example, we never talked to each other. We just exchanged email, no video until this moment. So this is the end of our presentation, summarizing our paper and speculating about what we got wrong. If you're interested in the broader research program we discussed today, here's some pointers to some of our papers from that era. And I guess it's Judy is next.
Pam, are you going to do introductions?
I'm just going to turn it over to you, Judy.
Good. Okay, let me do my screen share. There we go.
Yep, looks good.
Good. Right. Thank you for inviting me to comment on this. Actually, Gary and I both put this presentation together. Gary had cataract surgery yesterday, and we, being close collaborators, said, well, why doesn't Judy just do it? And so I'm here. So there was a great deal of impact at the time when this paper came out, because Gary and I were also doing work on distance collaboration, mainly in scientific collaborations, but then later in offices as well. So let me go through the pieces of the paper that really inspired us. First of all, it made it much easier for us to talk about where distance began, and so where all the principles of distance work had an effect. So the work that Ellen did, claiming 30 meters, and then the follow-on work that Kraut et al. Did, said that if you're in different floors of a building or different buildings on campus, again, that's distance work. On the upper right there is Bell Labs at Holmdel, where everything was quite distant, but we had vision between the floors, which was interesting. And then the lower part is Microsoft Redmond, a large campus where, of course, there's a lot of distance. The second concept that really helped us a lot was the model they had of collaboration and the phases of work. So work unfolds in phases, with meeting partner, defining problems, planning projects, supervising coworkers. And the whole principle is that some of those can be done at a distance and others not. And we picked up on that a lot and called tightly coupled, loose coupling. Tightly coupled work is best done co-located. That's the design phase, how we're going to present this, where there's a lot of back and forth for the people. But there's a lot of loosely coupled work that can be done at a distance, and that's for discovering in the Zoom world when those can be. What can I do independently, and what do I need the other people to be here with? So the third piece was their whole concept about the different tools. As we were looking at scientific laboratories and corporate sites, we were very vigilant to find out what tools they were using and how to characterize them all. We looked at the paper and found a very helpful categorization. Talked about communication, coordination, and then task-oriented tools. Excuse me. And indeed, we found that as well, but we also found some others. We found information repositories, especially in scientific collaboration, and then lots of issues about the infrastructure, especially if you're crossing organizational boundaries, and who's using which tools and what's the network capabilities, et cetera. We also recognized human computation, which was Mechanical Turk or any kind of crowdsourcing. So we use a diagram in a number of our papers on the right. As you see, it has coordination, communication at the top, which is synchronous or near synchronous, and then information repositories, and then coordination sort of covering both of those. And in all of this then is the infrastructure. But of course, today we've got to add another category, AI. And you know, none of us have talked about that yet, about where it's all going to fit in with all the rest of the stuff. Okay, so the lasting impact paper ends with a discussion of tools. An early line of work we did was exploring where there are better tools for collating, excuse me, doing co-located work, field studies of software design groups at Anderson Consulting. We saw several things that caught our eye. When a team member handed out a paper versus of a proposed system architecture, we found, this is on paper, we found that as the discussion went on, people were annotating their diagrams differently, and that was going to matter down the road. Furthermore, when they were brainstorming, they stopped when they ended at the end of the whiteboard. So this actually sounds very much like the point that's in the paper. It said participants all need to see, point to, and modify these texts and graphics objects. And as Bob has already mentioned, we developed Shred-it, which is an unfortunate name these days because there's a whole industry out there that's going to shred your information. We wanted to share it. As Bob said, it's a precursor of Google Docs. You can see in the diagram here, we have two open, this is very tiny screens back then, by the way, which is part of a problem. There's two open shared documents here. There was a private one at the bottom. We thought sometimes people want to form their thoughts and then paste it into the shared thing. And in all of our studies, nobody ever did that. They all just made everything public as they went. But we have a couple of other features here. So there's the names of everybody who's in this document right now. And then you want to go find where somebody's working, you can hit the find button, which you can do in Google Docs. You can track them, so keep going wherever they go. And then the third one, which is to reclaim the last, meaning go back to where I used to be, meaning where I was doing my work. And we've consulted with Google Docs to see if we can get that, because that's a very useful feature. Hasn't appeared yet. But so this is Shred-it. And we used it for a number of years, both in our own work and in our studies. And it turned out that people who were using it in our studies indeed made better designs because they're all focused on the same thing. It didn't take any less time, but it certainly did increase the quality of their work. So the other thing is there's, now I'm realizing that Gary and I actually live this. If you can see the background, we have radical co-location in that we communicate a lot because we're in the same office. But we also noticed this Ford Motor Company wanted to do a study with us. They're doing the mechanics of it, and then we were going to do the observations. What they did is put a study of 6 teams with 6 to 8 people on software engineering projects. And these teams, sorry, this has to build. These teams did not have any offices. They were in what they called war rooms. So they were large conference rooms or just large rooms where they put the desks around the outside and then had sort of a communal table in the middle, often with a whiteboard. And sometimes, you know, the copier and all kinds of other things in the middle where everybody has to go. At the time, there were statistics known about software productivity, both nationally and at Ford. So they could compare the productivity of these teams with that figure. We were brought on to watch them work to see what, if productivity changed, why it changed. What was different about all working in a room that you didn't get in regular offices and conference rooms. It turned out that then when they were radically co-located, they doubled their productivity and they liked it better. And it turned out from this, the result of these 6 teams, Ford Motor built a building that had just war rooms. There were no offices, just war rooms of different sizes for different projects. Plus sort of some offices nearby that had people who had a special skill like database design who could be brought into a project when needed. So we also found out then what happened during this. Here's an example. The team on the left, there's 3 people at the whiteboard. working on a problem. These two people are talking about something else, but they overhear what's going on at the whiteboard and join them. They realize instead of having, being in your offices and discovering this and then having to have a meeting down the road, it was just a fluid motion between everybody working together and then everybody going off to their own work. So it's already mentioned about hallway conversations. I love the video. And indeed, conversing about non-work topics helps group effectiveness. There's data on that. And it turns out, unfortunately, in Zoom, it has no hallways, although you'll hear from Krista later about hallways. But our own practice is that you just sign on 10 minutes early and talk about non-work stuff. And that's worked lots and lots of different meetings. I see everybody shaking their head that yes, this works very well. So just sign on early. So we did that today in order to get the bugs out of some of our software handoffs. But indeed, I'm in lots of other groups where we just sign on 10 minutes early and talk about how things are going or what we have in common or sports or whatever. So it's highly recommended for Zoom users. So that's it. You can see the work has coupled very tightly along these last 30 years, has very much lasting impact. And I give you congratulations, Bob and Carmen and Jolene, about really significant work early. Congratulations.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy. So our next three speakers are going to talk a little bit more about the relevance of this work, this 30-year-old work today, and the implications in our current environment. So I'll turn it over to Thomas Neumeyer.
Yes, thank you. Just trying to share. Hey, can you see my screen? Okay, thanks then. Good afternoon from Austria and welcome to my laudation talk. My name is Thomas Neumeyer and I'm a research associate at the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria. I thought it might be useful to say this because I'm not so famous as the other speakers maybe. And I'm also currently a PhD, final stage PhD student at the University Linz. And since around the year 2016, I'm deeply interested in hybrid collaboration and meetings. My task for this talk is to reflect on the suggested design implications for modern work, both remote and hybrid, and contemplate what is still relevant and what maybe isn't. In my opinion, the core statement of the paper that has relevance to what is being discussed today is that proximity is a predictor for collaboration. And both, as we heard, organizational and physical proximity are effective, but physical proximity has an independent effect on collaboration. And this is explained through unconstrained interactions we can have with people near us, enabling informal communication. And as stated before in my talk, I will focus on the suggested design implications, which can be divided into two categories. In my opinion, the first one would be high-quality real-time interactions, and the second one would be low-cost interactions. Concerning the first category, on page number 10, there is the same citation that Judith before me also found interesting, because there are some descriptions of what makes real-time interactions high quality. And these statements foreshadow a little bit the media space theory by Bill Buxton, I think. So when the authors write about participants being able to see, point to, and modify objects, this is very much reflective of Buxton's task and reference space. And later, they go on to highlight the speaker's ability to receive feedback by their listeners, which is indicative of the person space. And in my experience, these different channels of communication are a very capable framework to think about current tools and what they should provide. They are frequently used to guide the design of new systems. As you can see in the random compilation on the lower right, many current researchers use this kind of thinking to determine what contributes to perceptions of high-quality real-time interactions. Concerning the second category, the envisioned low-cost interactions, we can say that the monetary cost nowadays is marginal because most devices are constantly connected to broadband internet. And they are also typically equipped with a range of sensors and modalities that enable extensive audiovisual communication. But in our own research with several teams during a nationally mandated lockdown, participants told us that the perceived proximity of others was a double-edged sword. In this remote-only context, communication frequency was often increased, and nevertheless, these interactions were seen as less fulfilling by many. And most importantly, almost everything happened within the already existing relationships, which are also mentioned in the paper. So in summary, having low-cost, high-quality real-time interactions can be seen as a prerequisite for successful collaboration. From a technological standpoint, we are much farther along the way today than we were in 1988. For example, judging from our own research, the mentioned spontaneous exchange of notes and documents is already mostly solved by current technology when we think about remote collaboration. However, in hybrid settings, we oftentimes encounter situations in which participants would have wanted to share analog artifacts with their remote peers, which is often not trivial. Participants try to show quick analog sketches to the remotes by holding them towards the camera, which is awkward in itself. And then the background effects blur the things we effortfully wanted to share with the others. To summarize, while I think that many of the pitfalls described in the 1988 paper have been solved, at least from a technological perspective, issues are still present in hybrid settings, many of which are concerned with transferring the analog to digital and probably also vice versa. In a nutshell, one could say that technology is ready, but concrete applications and their usage present unanswered questions. The devil is in the details. So to summarize, it is my impression that distance is still important, but our current tools decrease the relative importance. Some tasks can even profit from remote collaboration, and still proximity is important in the early phases of a collaborative project, even more so for maintaining personal relationships. And even though we now have the opportunity to engage in low-cost, high-quality synchronous interactions, recent research has shown that it just did not happen sometimes, or interactions happened too frequently in recent years, leading to considerations around boundary management and resulting in word creations such as Zoom fatigue. And in order not to further contribute to Zoom fatigue, I will close my talk now by pointing out a statement which might have inspired the 1992 paper Beyond Being There by Holland and Stornetta, which also discusses that instead of merely replicating face-to-face encounters, technology might present us with ways of doing it completely differently. Thank you very much for your attention, and congratulations to the authors for their Lasting Impact Award.
Thank you, Thomas. All right, so with that, we're going to turn it over to John Tang, who's going to sort of continue on this reflection of what remains relevant today and implications for modern work.
Great. I think you can see my slides. So I wanted to just express my gratefulness for being able to reflect on this paper, which certainly had a huge impact on me. I remember reading it as a graduate student, and actually really liked how Tomas included a picture of him in 1988. It would have been great if all of the panelists had figured out a picture of themselves from that time. But just to pick up on some of the ways in which they summarized this paper, I loved how even in the abstract, they talked about how, as Pam referred to, the guidelines they provided for a foundation for discussing the actual and potential role of communications technology in professional work, especially for collaboration carried out at a distance. And indeed, this work inspired me to focus a lot of my research career on creating technologies and studying technologies to connect people across distance. I also liked how they focused on physical proximity and the ways that they cleverly characterized and captured and isolated how physical proximity, the role that it played in supporting collaboration. So I liked how Bob mentioned these methods of going up to people and asking, you know, how they started conversing, or the video clips that actually captured these spontaneous connections afforded by physical distance. So making it possible to figure out how people actually carried out their research through their physical space. And I love the reminder of what workplaces look like then. So hard offices, corridors, people walking around and running into each other. And I would contrast that with what offices look like now. Many high-tech companies have moved to this totally open plan workspace areas, perhaps inspired by the war room research that Judy talked about, even to the point that there's now technology products offered to shut out all that distraction, which I think is truly ironic. All the richness and beauty that physical proximity offers, as documented in this paper, we now can buy something to mask that out, because that's some of the downsides of at least some of the open work plan experience places that I've experienced, and especially now that so much of our work includes a remote collaboration to places that creates noise among other people. And also, of course, even more recently, workplaces now look like this, where we are working from home, remote physically from the people that we work with, and now physically proximate to a bunch of other things, family life, things in the home that could be distracting us from work. So I think it's interesting to think about how the principles of this paper apply to this new workplace arrangement. I also want to reflect on how communication technology has changed between then and now. So back then, it still was postal mail. And if you quickly dismiss this, I still remember at that time, pasting together literally camera-ready copies where we would put printed text on templates and bring it to FedEx to courier into conferences in time. So there was still a lot of physical mail. Obviously, phones were a big technology. Perhaps what funded this research at Belcor is the phone system. Early, kind of what we might think of as primitive email by what we're used to now. And then physical spaces that were intentionally designed to afford this kind of interaction, the so-called water cooler effect, which still is around today in terms of how our workplaces are designed. Now, I would contrast that with what we think of as communication technology now. It was referred to, lightweight text messaging has certainly become a very popular way to interact, especially on mobile devices that allow us to be available anywhere at any time. Video calling systems, such as the system we're using today to connect over distance. And something that's near and dear to my heart, telepresence robots. This is a technology that I use to connect from my workplace here in Silicon Valley, California, to that Microsoft campus that Judy mentioned in her picture up in Redmond, which shows that it has expanded beyond even Redmond. And so I've used this a lot pre-pandemic to connect with my colleagues, and as we've been emerging the pandemic, I've started using this on a kind of weekly basis, which shows how kind of at a visceral level, telepresence robots allow me to cross a physical distance. So I would say that these technologies overcame some of the barriers of distance, but they do so based on an understanding from this paper. What's important about collaboration, that we can design some tools to overcome those barriers. And just to highlight some of the text from the papers, our view is that communication technologies that allow free-form interaction in real-time and time-shifted modes to substitute for and even augment physical proximity are likely to yield great benefits. I do think that the recent technologies we've been using fulfill this prophecy, although I'd say time-shifted modes is an area for even more exploration. We got an example of that in Carmen's recorded kind of time-shifted presentation even today. And I think there's more opportunities there. And also they mentioned to maintain this level of communication in the absence of proximity requires technology that makes communication cheap frequent, and spontaneous enough that collaborators can be in touch as easily as if their offices were next door to each other. And in many ways, right, sending a text message today over Slack or over SMS is easier than getting up and maybe going to the next door office. And so I think that, again, fulfills that promise. So, one way I might summarize what's changed is that technology development and, importantly, technology adoption has reduced the cost and increased the richness of meeting remotely through tools that offer things like video or even, again, text. And the pandemic's increased our awareness of the cost of meeting in person. I mean, for a time, meeting together physically proximate was put our well-being at risk. And even now, I think people, despite offices being reopened, are reconsidering the costs of, well, what does that commute really mean? Do I need to do it every day? And if so, how can I kind of manage that or balance that with other things I like to be doing in my life? So I do want to close with one kind of opportunity that I see where I think remote collaboration technology has been good at supporting the strong ties during the pandemic. Part of the vacuum that at least I feel is that I don't have the richness of the weak ties or the kind of unplanned actions. And so extracting how physical proximity supports weak ties, I think, is an area that's ripe for future research. And I think that's an opportunity for this work to have lasting impact even into our future, where there's still several problems to solve. So with that, I want to again thank the authors and congratulate them for contributing this work to our body, and have this chance to reflect with the other panelists here, who I believe now turns over to Krista.
Yes. So we're going to hear from Krista, who's going to sort of continue the conversation around evolving technologies to support distant work.
Good morning, everybody. Do you see my presentation? Yes. Okay. Let me put this on slideshow. So I want to complement what has been said about the work by talking about some of the connections with virtual and mixed reality. And for those of you who don't know me, and I'm not, squarely in the CSCW community, you can Google me and find my credentials out there. But these are the things that you probably don't find immediately. I am a developer of Open Simulator, which is an open source alternative to Second Life. So it's a virtual environment for collaboration and spending time together. I've been involved with the conference, Open Simulator Community Conference, since 2013. This is an annual conference that's been going on. It's entirely in the virtual convention center. This started way before the pandemic. I did a keynote back in 2019 at CSCW about virtual conferences, precisely. And again, this was before the pandemic. I'm a very strong advocate of virtualization for purposes of, saving the world. And I also teach in virtual environments. I'm actually teaching a course this quarter using an open simulator, environment for the students to do assorted projects. So I wanted to focus on a few spots on the paper that I found interesting. One is this quote of that the behavioral cost for the user needs to be low for these things to work, and the other one is that these collaborations, these technology-mediated collaborations, mean a two-way or end-to-end communication involving more than one sensory channel. And finally, this is a quote at the end of the paper. To overcome the limitations of physical proximity, we can imagine video hallways, which we saw a little demo, or other communication technologies that would provide virtual proximity to a larger or more appropriate set of colleagues. So there's this idea of electronic hallways that very much kind of suggest, some sort of virtual presence being in video or something else. So the sensory channels, there are many, right? There's the, what we call modalities these days. There's text chatting that focuses on words, where there's an explicit conversation as represented by the words, can be time shifted, it's convenient. There's voice chatting, so this is the audio channel, so in which you get more than the words, you also get the intonation, so you can sense if someone is annoyed or amused or having fun. And this is in real time. There's, of course, video conferencing, in which besides the words and the intonation, you can also look at the facial expressions and some extent the body language of the person, so addresses a little bit of the non-verbal communication that is necessary also for communication in general. And then there's a fourth part in here, which is virtualization of assorted things. And so one component of virtualization is virtualization of the person themselves. So, and this is when the video, the real, literal representation of a person is substituted by some avatar. And where, the avatar can be a static picture, but it can also be a moving avatar that somehow reflects, whatever the person is doing in real life. So the avatarization gives the opportunity for filtering and also mediating the non-verbal communication. So, certain things that the person does that may or may not be transmitted into the other side, and also a complete reconstruction of how a person wants to be represented, being represented by a furry cat or something like that. So all of this has to do with again, non-verbal communication. Then we also have virtual reality, which is the construction of artificial 3D places. This has not necessarily anything to do with the persons or their representations, but with the environment, right? And same thing with mixed reality, when you overlay interactive virtual elements into physical spaces. So this virtual and mixed reality really are here to address the context, the space, the environmental context of a collaboration, of an interaction. So if you kind of pick some words in here, you will kind of start seeing the elements of collaboration. It's words, intonation, facial expressions, body language, filtering and mediation of nonverbal communication, and also the environmental context. And you get these kinds of things, you get it in when you have people collaborating in physical space, and you also get them when you have people collaborating in virtual spaces. I thought I saw that also kind of being laid out in certain ways in the paper in 1988, and it's still true today, I think. So this environmental context here would be the electronic hallways in a way of the paper. So I just want to put a little bit of context of where were we in 1988. Of course, we already had a lot of remote collaboration even then. So, in the 1970s, there were the explosion of the multi-user dungeons, which were these primarily text-based virtual spaces or stories that had, very popular in certain communities. We had, things like the first virtual world called Habitat in 1987. It was developed by Lucasfilm. Then, of course, in the 90s, a little, shortly after this paper, there was Doom, the video game, and then the dawn of video gaming, right? And we see now that millions of people playing together in these virtual spaces, which is interesting. Is an interesting observation that, yes, the paper that we are talking about focuses on scientific collaborations, which is a very kind of specific mode of collaboration, or with very specific outputs. But if we just talk about collaboration in general, because scientists also live with the rest of everybody, you can see a little bit of what is happening, and the fact that these virtual spaces are so compelling for people to kind of have fun together. And that is an important thing, the fact that it's possible to have activities in these virtual spaces and activities that are engaging and that people can have fun together. So that somehow we have not been able to leverage that so much for scientific collaborations, and there's probably reasons why, but it's something that I think we need to be watching, because it's definitely working for millions of online gamers. So I mean, these virtual and mixed spaces have there's a sense of being there, because what virtual reality and mixed reality address that all the other modalities don't address is the environment, the context, is the fact that you can build up these spaces. Some of them are not possible in real life. Some of them transcend real life. They can do things in there that you cannot do in real life, like flying and all sorts of things. But there's a sense of being there. There's a sense that that's a space, and there's a sense of proximity. The way that our brain works is that we are very, very much tuned to absorb 3D in spaces, and so there's a sense of being there together. But there's some challenges and opportunities in here for informal collaboration that is necessary also for scientific collaborations, which is some of the challenges that are in the two. And I'm not going to talk about the technology challenges, because I think those would be overcome sooner or later. The fact that there's this clunky headsets and whatnot, all that will be fixed. There's no question in my mind. But even when all that is fixed, there's still some fundamental challenges. One of them is the time shift that we all experience. Like, for example, we're here. This is a global event. I had to wake up at 5:30 in the morning to be here. And some of you are, awake very late wherever you are. So the time zones are a drag, and it's not something that we can fix anytime soon. And I think that virtual mixed spaces are unrelated to activities in real life. And this may be a problem for scientific collaborations. What I mean is that if you are in the same corridor, the same physical corridor, you walk to the bathroom or you walk to the cafeteria as part of your physical needs, right? You have a physical need and you walk, and in that walk, you may find somebody that, with whom you have this straight conversation. That's not the case in these virtual spaces, right? If I'm here and I stand up, we'll go to the kitchen, it's my house. I'm not meeting anybody who's in the virtual space. It's a different universe. So that is something that cannot be easily overcome, and that will always be there, no matter how good the technology actually gets. On the other hand, there are some opportunities, and I think it can transcend what can be done in collaborative, in collaborations in physical space, which is that we can have these new activities that can really be fun. Go see something, some arts installation in virtual space that cannot be done in real world, for example. There's all sorts of interesting things for creative activities in these spaces, and that are engaging and that people want to be there. There's also some form of serendipity from proximity in virtual spaces. So, when I attend, for example, the OSCC conference, the fact that my avatar is sitting to a few other avatars, again, the fact that my brain is tuned to interpret the 3D spaces in a certain way, it just, the fact that there's avatars near me sometimes encourages to, start these conversations with those people, even though maybe I don't even know them, and that certainly happened. So it's a mixed bag. I thought it was very interesting that the paper was didn't quite address virtual reality, which is certainly still not really a thing in 1988, but there are some connections in there, and there's something that can certainly be explored. Also, because in terms of research, virtual and mixed environments are and basically an open whiteboard. It's basically, we don't really know what works, you know, in a systematic study kind of thing. We don't really know what works. We know it works very well for online games, but other than that, for actual sort of work collaborations, we don't know what works. So it will be interesting to see what happens. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you, Krista. Okay, so what we're going to do now is open it up to the panelists who might have questions for one another. And the Q&A is also available to the audience. So if you've got any questions, please put them into the Q&A and then I will moderate. Judy.
Yes, I just want to follow on with Krista, that I've recently discovered something called Sococo, SOCOCO, and it is a virtual reality office, in that you can construct it however you want to, but you have an office with a door, and it turns out if your door is shut, then it means don't disturb me. If it's open a little bit, you know, if you really have to, etc. There's signaling there. But as soon as your avatar goes into my office, we are immediately on video conferencing. And there are other systems similar to that where there's a sort of open conversation space. And again, if I move my avatar close to you, not real close, but somewhat close, then I can hear you talking to somebody, but then I can come even closer. And again, we're in video conferencing with no links sent around or anything like that. So I think the virtual reality that you were talking about is also morphing a bit more to the office. It's worth looking into. It looks really interesting.
Great. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Well, I've got a question, and this maybe is for Bob and Jolene, but also for others. One of the things is Krista was talking, I was thinking about the role of spontaneity versus intentionality. And some of the technologies that we're talking about really require kind of intentionally reaching out. So what are the implications of that when we're talking about informal communication?
Well, I guess I think that one of the reasons we found it interesting to look at the initiation of collaborations was because an awful lot of those first steps were not intentional, but collaborations emerged from the spontaneous discovering who's kind of around, interesting to work with, has good ideas, is fun to talk to. And then it's kind of transitioning to something that is more intentional. But we looked at as Krista said, we kind of looked at a weird environment where people actually had discretion to work with whom they wanted to work with. And so if you're a software engineer and you're on a project, you don't have that discretion. And so you're shoved into what Jolene talked about as the execution phase immediately.
Yeah, John.
I do think that comment is related to my kind of wondering about encouraging weak ties or allowing these sort of unintended interactions to occur, which I find missing in our online experience. You know, someone pointed out how, you know, if you look into someone's office, you're aware of other people who's talking to whom. And in Zoom or video calling, I can see someone in a video call, but I have no idea whom they're talking with. And which of course makes a lot of sense for certain privacy reasons, but also misses out on the workplace awareness of what kinds of people are interacting with other folks, which I think is, again, part of that vacuum that I'm feeling in our current work experience.
Great, thank you. We do have a question from the participants here. Chihan Wang says, the video window in the paper is cool. Inspired by this, my question is, Since we heavily rely on remote work today and technology has made great progress in the last 30 years, how can we support spontaneous communication and online communication today? What motivates people to start spontaneous communication online? Is there any online signal that has a similar function as eye contact in reality? Thanks. I think any of our panelists could jump in and answer that.
Maybe I can just start with one thought. I think a prerequisite for this might be that there is even some form of awareness that there's some other person around. And there has been some works concerning remote online communication. I think it was a paper by Xu et al. In 2017 or so. And it was about attention from afar, where they simulated the gaze of remote participants in a meeting room by placing something like an ambient display in the center of a table, where we could see in which directions these people were currently looking in a video conference meeting. I think this would be maybe something as a prerequisite to even engaging with other people to know that they are there in the first place. But yes, it's still a very open field, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, presence, the sense of presence is the number one requirement for people to strike a conversation. So if you sense that other people are present in some way, then that's the first thing that kind of prompts you perhaps to reach out to that person. And presence can be represented in many ways, depending on, especially in technology mediated applications. Yeah.
Right. Judy.
You're muted, Judy.
You're muted.
Still muted.
You think I would learn?
There you go.
Sorry. So I think what Krista was talking about in having conferences online, if you see the same avatar in two different talks that are potentially interesting to you, and that same person was in both of them, you might be more likely to chat with them. So have you found that in your studies at all, Krista?
I haven't. I have not studied these kinds of collaborations. I'm more of a technologist. I find that actually fascinating. I like to come here to kind of hear, what social scientists and psychologists know about how people interact in these environments. I only have my own, my own ad hoc impressions of navigating these environments, and definitely, I mean, that is definitely true for me. If I see the same avatar, repeatedly in the same virtual spaces where I am, then that starts signaling something, and that's true also for if you see the same face in different conferences, it's the same kind of thing.
Let me just follow on that. I think if I were not retired, in this particular conversation, I would like to work with Krista more about the behavioral aspects of her virtual reality, and also to hook up with the people at Sococo and how they do the technical part about if you're really close, then you're immediately into video conferencing. But I'm retired. Somebody else take that one.
Where do you, Bob?
I think, though, that this discussion is having some of the same problems that we had in kind of the early 1990s, which is there's too much of a focus on this visual component. Think about going into a kind of text group where there might be 30 to 50 to 100 or 150 people there. You see who's talking, you get the sense of what they're like. You can see who's responding to them. It doesn't require you to be able to see them and to have eye contact. What's missing in many of those online groups, though, is that you don't see the lurkers. And as a result, this, what Pam was asking about, or Judith about hanging out with the people whose attendance is kind of aligned with yours, who goes to the same sessions that you do. You miss that in many of these online groups, but you can get some, if you think about what you're trying to accomplish, you should be focusing on that rather than focusing on the high-tech tool that allows you to know who's around.
If I could just build on that a little bit, more recently, my work has focused on accessibility and making remote communication accessible to people of all abilities. And Bob's comment about over relying on visual also has some accessibility challenges. So I think by thinking about how we could create sort of multimodal signals of attention or one intentionality or wanting to talk, I think that would benefit all of us. Just as an example, you know, we're at the verge of maybe learning some new behaviors to contribute or get attention. The whole Zoom hand raise, virtual hand raise versus the visual hand raise, right? It means that there are other ways of kind of sharing or turn taking that could augment our kind of physical senses.
Great. So I'm going to just read one last question. Oh, actually, now we've got two questions. So I'm going to read this one. Hello, this is from Ginaldo Gomez. Hello, I love the presentation. Recently, music events are realized in virtual environments, such as games. What kind of behaviors or factors can improve the sense of being there in these environments?
I would say not just being spectators together, but being actors together. So, you know, yes, you see now, you know, famous rock stars or whatever doing concerts in some of these more modern games and stuff, and it's a very impressive show for sure. But you know, still those kinds of small groups of players doing on a raid together, I think provides us even a stronger sense of being there together than just watching a concert in virtual reality. So it's basically having people actively engaged in the same activity together. Definitely enhances that feeling of being there together.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, John.
I think music is a great example of, again, appealing to a sense not visual, and also kind of points out to how underexplored haptic kind of sense of being there is in our current realm of technologies as another area of future work.
Great. Okay, on that last comment, we're going to wrap this session up. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, to Judy, to Thomas, to John, to Krista, and of course, to Bob, Jolene, and Carmen. And again, just a huge congratulations to Bob, Jolene, and Carmen for winning the Lasting Impact Award. And thank you to you for producing that paper that has been so generative, has had such an impact, and is still in our thinking today.
Thank you.
Thank the audience for showing up. Thank you. All right.
Hey, everyone. As Tony transitions us to the closing slides, I want to thank Pam, the panelists, and also the Lasting Impact Awards for this wonderful discussion. It's amazing to see how timely this work is. You know, after 30 years, we're still talking about this. And, you know, that there's still a lot of interesting research questions to explore. And, you know, as Bob always tells me, a good research is one that makes us ask more questions. So, you know, really hope that we will continue to explore these topics and try to find better ways for us to think about how to do virtual work and also, you know, support kind of remote work. Now, believe it or not, this was the last session of CSCW 2022. And we want to use this chance to do a quick recap of the conference and thank our sponsors and team, and also introduce the 2023 chairs. Since the conference has begun, we've had a few more registrants. So we've passed the 800 attendees mark. We're now at 815. Although, as Tony has noted, we unfortunately still don't have any attendees from Antarctica. And, as Tony has also mentioned during the opening plenary, this wasn't the conference that we had initially hoped to organize. This was my chance to combine two things that I love together, CSCW and Taiwan. But when we decided to go virtual this year, we also decided that we didn't want to just try out another kind of replicate another in-person experience online. And in many ways, I'm very proud of the variety of things that we were able to explore at this conference. And we're also very thankful for your support throughout. You may not have realized it, but you have just participated in many firsts at CSCW. And we'll go through some of these. This includes this being the longest CSCW there's ever been. This was the first multi-week CSCW conference. This was also the first time that we built this TV program out of CSCW papers. I think we just need to run a few more ads in between the sessions, and we can generate some constant flow of revenue for the community. We also explored the use of GatherTown for a 24-hour living viewing space for our colleagues from around the world. I saw many of you in this space showing off your dance moves. And though Discord has been used for other conferences, this was also the first time CSCW used it. And again, I saw a number of great near synchronous discussions here. Similarly, this was also CSCW's first time using Gather for poster demo receptions, which also allowed us to bring a bit of Taiwan experience to our virtual attendees. And many of you may not know, but there was actually a special password protected SV lounge in the Gather space. It's not too late to befriend an SV, and maybe they'll be willing to take you in for a tour. So you can still check it out. We'll leave the Gather space up for a couple more weeks. And it's also important to note that we did all this while keeping the registration fee at the lowest it's ever been at CSCW. We've always talked about how our registration fees is a barrier for participation for many, and our team worked hard to keep this cost down. And now at the end of the conference, I can say that, also building on the discussion that we just had, that there are definitely things that I've enjoyed about this conference, but there are also things that I would like to iterate on. And Tony and I hope to share our reflections and summarize our observations. We would also love to hear from you. We will be sending out a survey to our attendees in a week or two. The hope is that the insights gained here will be able to contribute to future conferences, right? So fingers crossed that we don't have to do another virtual conference again. But even then, there's no reason for the community just to meet once a year in person, right? There could be asynchronous and also hybrid experiences that we can use to complement our in-person conferences.
So we'd like to offer many, many thanks. Whoops, here we go. First of all, to Kai and ACM for providing support and funding to make the conference go. We'd also like to thank our chancellor, Meta, as well as our benefactors, Google, and our friend Wood Institute, Perfect, and Cyberlink. We also want to offer many thanks to our 2022 organizing team. A lot of folks spent countless hours putting things together. And in a virtual conference, we have a harder time getting visibility on what they did and who they are. So I wanted to take a few minutes to sort of race through and tell you briefly what each of these folks did to help make the conference go. First, our paper chairs, Hao Chuan, Hideaki, Naomi, and Katarina. This has been a monster of a task to organize papers across multiple intake cycles, like hundreds of hours, and probably almost hundreds of ACs. It was a monumental task and is ongoing, as the 2023 chairs will tell you. It seems to be an overlapping task. The editors are the ones that actually make the decisions. So thank you to Sue, Irina, John, Sean, Vera, Andreas, Morgan, and Sharon for making the decisions on the papers that we see ultimately at the conference. Our awards chairs also have a massive task. So Tina and Ben and Cheyenne, they read through essentially the best papers, the nominees. They make a lot of decisions with an entire team. So it's like almost another committee. Our workshop and doctoral consortium chairs worked largely independently from us. They organized, figured out which workshops would run. They organized the doctoral consortium, welcomed a whole new a cohort of PhD students into our community. Our posters and demos chairs worked overtime, Mia, Fabiano, Liwei, and Juho, to try to figure out how to make this thing work and to get the content coordinate with the authors to make sure they knew when they were supposed to show up to present their work. So thank you for them. Charlotte Stewart, Elizabeth Churchill, and Pamela Hines, you just saw lasting impact session. The panel is by Charlotte and Stewart, and Churchill ran a translational science panel earlier today. So thank you to all of them. Joey and Elena took on a really hard task. Taking some half-baked idea from Gary and me and trying to create a brand new program that was specifically designed for a larger group of incoming students and emerging scholars that had a hard time kind of getting to know other scholars during the time of virtual conferences. So they created a program of AMAs with established scholars and got them into group meetings with them. And so thank you to Elena for executing or planning and executing that entire program. Our virtual conference chairs, Sue, Sharon, Aaron, Jay, and Corey, met with us on a regular basis on Thursdays, different times and time zones for, I don't know, the better part of a half a year. So thank you to all of them for figuring out what this conference experience was going to look like and actually executing on all of that. Dongwook Yoon is our unsung hero. He is the Seoul Videos chair. Who took on the job and figured out how to take all the videos in, how to get them choreographed into something that would play, get them delivered to the Sinkai Videos team, massive task. And he also coordinated the Discord bot that would announce papers when they were being played and stuff. So he ran the whole video program. So thank you very much, Luke. Our web and communications chairs were the ones that ran the Twitter and the web, and so they were principal contact for communicating with our community. So thank you to Carrie, Brett, Tiffany, Jichong, and Durukshi. Our equity and diversity and meta chairs. So Kate and Jean worked tirelessly to advocate for various equity concerns and make sure that our platforms worked well for all of our participants. They were especially vocal in making sure the conference fees were as low as they possibly. So thank you to their efforts. Christina and Leo have worked on questionnaires that you will see soon. Next up, thank you to Dakwa and Stanley for actually finding money from sponsors. And thank you to Rasta and Jen for helping to figure out how we'd spend all the money and helping us with the budget. Our registration chairs, Brian and Yubo, helped to figure out how the registration system would work. Surprisingly more complex than I believed. But we learned many things there. Shunru, Pamela, and worked to be our coordinators between us and chair. Our local chairs and Jones worked really hard to figure out what the conference was going to look like when we were planning on going to Taiwan. They brought us a whole bunch of items and figured all these amazing places that we would go. And they were the people that we were most sad to disappoint when we had to tell them that we were moving online. They did, however, work really hard to immediately help us to recruit a virtual environment team. And so the students that you see there are the folks that actually helped to design the Gather space. And they worked a long time to come up with things and deal with all of our feedback on how it should work and how it should flow. And if you saw the number of iterations, it was literally like they created multiple worlds that we turf at different times. The thing that you see at the end is a bit of a giraffe. Finally, thank you so much to our student volunteer chairs, Genevieve, Yo-Yo. it is impossible to overstate the contribution that these two and the student volunteers made to this conference. It is one thing to run a conference that runs for a week. It is another thing to throw at them the idea that the conference is going to run for 2 weeks, and for the general chairs not to quite have a clear idea of just how much work is going to be involved. So Gary and I slept very well many nights, and it was thanks to the efforts of Genevieve and for figuring out many of the things. Of course, all of the student volunteers that would actually execute on all of these tasks. So there were 107 of them working in lots and lots of different time zones, and so figuring out their tasks, trying to communicate them to them, dealing with emergencies. This is something that the student volunteers did amazingly well, and this is them playing a little bit in the CSCW hall just earlier today.
I also want to say thank you to Tony for being such a wonderful co-chair. Many of you don't know, but he stepped up actually late last year to be my co-chair. And I wasn't sure, you know, I've met him before, I've never worked with him, but I've heard great things about him and wasn't sure if he was going to agree to do this, but he did, and I'm really grateful for it. He's been my support throughout this process, and it's been great working with him, and hopefully we'll have a chance to work together again. But 4 years ago, we proposed the plan to host CSCW in Taiwan and kind of use this as an opportunity to further help strengthen the CSCW community in Asia. We've done that in 2012, I believe. John was part of that effort, and so was Pam. And really wanted to use this chance to kind of revisit that and also kind of strengthen the community there. And while we were not able to do that in person this year, many of our collaborators have spent a lot of effort in community building. And I've seen a lot of positive outcomes from these efforts, from students that I've been tracking who are pursuing research in this space to a growing number of faculty and labs doing this exciting work there, right? And this really has been going on for a while, and we're just trying to sort of further build up on that. But the truth is obviously that there's still a lot more work left to do. And I'm hopeful that within the next few years, we can have another sort of, or a more properly CSCW hosted in Asia, and really looking forward to that. But before that day comes, we would like to introduce you to Casey and Lauren and to talk to us about CSCW 2023.
Hi, this is so exciting. And I actually want to start by saying thank you to Tony and Gary and the entire CSCW 2022 team on behalf of myself and Lauren, and also the entire CSCW community, because what you were able to pull together, especially after all of this planning, was really amazing, and we're so grateful. And now we can look forward to the future and our first in-person CSCW in 3 years. Next year, we hope to see many of you in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in October. Bring your coats. So let me just say briefly a few things about the conference next year. So first of all, my co-chair is Lauren Trevine, who is here as well. And the conference will take place October 13th through 18th. We have a website up now. It's great. Thank you to our new web chairs. And our goal is to have an excellent blended hybrid experience to the very best of our ability. So there will be hybrid blended elements with virtual registration for this conference. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but we are working very hard on that. And for our in-person interactions, we are working hard to figure out how to balance interaction with safety. we are still in a pandemic. We're happy to talk to anyone about the conference. You can, we've had an email alias for a while now. You are welcome to reach out to Lauren and I. And of course, you already have been hearing a lot about the CSCW 2023 because we are like well into papers already, because our the first cycle that began CSCW 2023 papers was this past July. You have probably seen this great timeline before, and you have been interacting with our papers chairs, Moon, Sharon, Cheyenne, and Fabiano, as well as our editors. And the next paper deadline is not very far from now. It is in January. And so we are really looking forward to all of the great papers that we're going to see this time next year. And also, we have an amazing organizing committee now. Lots of people who have signed on for this first ever blended CSCW, our first in-person CSCW in quite a while. And we are really grateful to everyone who is getting us started on this journey now. And you will now find information about all of these people, and in the future, as we know more about exactly what the conference is going to look like, you can find all of this on our new website. And we are so excited to see you next year at CSCW in Minneapolis and online. And with that, that is officially the end of CSCW 2022. And I can't wait to hear from everyone more in the next year. So thank you, everyone, especially the 2022 organizing team, and we'll see you in Minneapolis.